metal ingot, right? You got this metal ingot, and we're gonna be mind thinking about the inverse of the standard model. You're gonna take this metal ingot that's gravitationally attached to what I'm holding, so it's an atmospheric system, solids and atomic suspension, a lot of conductive bands on the top. You got your radiologics and your two-dimensional surface intercept to a mirror finish of what it might be looking at around. If this happens to be a polished ingot in your mind, for now. Now, what we need to do is we need to now imagine that we're in a spaceship with basically an aerogel that's about to just dissipate. So it's kind of the opposite now. So we're in this spaceship and we're in free float, right? So it's easy to hold now, and we have to be real careful. It's real spherical. It's still kind of held together until like the hand coupling isn't there. We'll just say it like that, right? So there it is now, and so we're gonna release this like right there, and what ends up happening is if it's in free suspension, it could start globulating like a little comet, like an actual orbital kind of Oort cloud condensing or coalescing into a spot, right? And we know because it's in free fall that's gonna probably be in the center if it was just a simple system and I had released it in one place, and it just happens to be just enough to, you know, it's kind of an inspirational radio hewing of the what we're best at sensing, because there's that radial bands, and so we're working with that kind of avenue now back on this ingot. And the reason why is now we're going to try to do this slightly more complicated, where we're thinking about the gravitational impact in a vortex of crystalline nodules within this metal composition, where the subtle differences in cooling created that gradient of matchup of interference patterns that sum total the radial effect of that node into the position relative of frames of perspective, kind of a Euler's matchup, right? So with that kind of sack and saddle and suspension, you have the resonance of the fields around, and you have that system there, and you can start to imagine a surface that can have inherently quite a few processors in radius, and it points out logic of field energy effect, and that happens to be a nice dense subset for maybe like a super cooling set, and you might then have that data in phase lock, where you're trying to store photonic energy near that zero intercept of light, and just compartmentally retaining or nesting the density of energy there. It might work better without the material there at some point, so maybe there's an empty area in there. I don't know. You figure that out. That's beyond me. But I'm trying to look at the standard model and appreciate where science should match back up with quantum law, and what might be what design would call the most redundant format. If you build a ship in an automated, like a leaflet of defensive strategy, a leaf, where you have like a slide bar of redundancy. So it's like, how much sunblock do you want? And so the vessel itself can reformulate using the mathematics of science into some kind of lens in that direction, like a walnut, where the valence electrons are all radially just ready to absorb all the wavelengths possible from all of the gravitational wave intercepts that are sensing that something sketchy might be about to happen. So this might just be like a fusion fest of energy uptake where we just go ahead and utilize that, like basically to garner as much of the total shock wave an inspirational swirl to make our own eddy current of basically phase battery from it. And so by keeping that logic in the system, then one massive absorption basically could be distributed throughout that entire volume proportionately, or would be eventually distributed through it proportionately. You got to figure that part out. But it's amazing to me that that's where the ion blast seemed to lead if you use volumetric uniform on uniform type models and not limit anything out of a system. There's always a temporal banding based off of the insulation present to field intercepts of, tetrahedral like takes of linear forces to planar forces. Once you're on planar forces, then you look for what I think, well, logically, we consider it solid state switches, and that kind of toggles in an electromechanical sense what kind of field change that would make. It's like the edge of nodes, kind of changing that around at that point when one is activated or inactivated. So by comparing that beat against all of the individual nodes inside of a sensor set, then it's in effect a wave composition, which I would call a Kepler switch, because suddenly you have that orbital difference of, something is now more inclusive than that one inspirational, what do you call it, like a prime number to complete description of a massive interference pattern, the total sum of energy that was able to be retained at that one BEC phase match over time, right? Or the time that it's been recording, or basically the mass of how much energy is retained in the total investment into that mapping strategy, into a process dynamo of storing a local or relativistic map of what's happened. And so what happens is that when the vessel moves around, the entire processor works on just redirecting the energy such that the move is still retaining the data set in there. Does that make sense? By going through as an observer, it warps automatically based off of the total processor or vessel moving around in space. Or, like we were talking about before, if it starts as kind of a materialistic, maybe that's all we have. We just start with that kind of thing and end up building it out with basically wherever we can, possibly in space, where we can control those MX ingredients, and then through field energy change, like a router in the middle of an assembly room, bring those compositions together and then start stacking compositions, and then have that be what is like almost extruded on a conveyor belt of prepared of that dimension of Q, process logic. But the quantum dot positioning, that's real fancy. And that's something that can have so many different mem gear set avenues, where the temporal, that's the real key there. Is remember how there's a temporal difference on how a frequency makes something, a quantum dot, actually fluoresce, and that difference of time ends up making a strength to the field. And using that kind of logic of maybe like a strength of control over the field on when that characteristic happens in ratio to everything else, that becomes something to work towards, finding memory gear sets or mem gear sets to bring as many different energy compositions into that kind of plant. What's that term? Medullary, the single cells, the mitochondrial, I want to say, that use chlorophyll or whatever to get the energy out of the sun in a similar composition, like the sugar crystal itself, with by polarizing to both end caps in a clear tube, YouTube that's kind of cool. Then it builds this spiral process where it starts making sense on how sugar becomes such a foundational energy for keeping a harmonious balance off of the disposition of proteins and lipid lipid surfaces, causing a surface of potential refraction and color hues on metallic surfaces within the inner nodes to fine tune the overall composition. As that's where I'm kind of headed with the foundation of the science being on the speed of light, and then setting that track to light lag, which would be clusters of systems that in harmony have a net effect, like AC systems, the harmony of hydraulics and radio interaction, and that subset of taking that signal and amplifying it with other devices. I hope I was recording.